Okay, let's get into it. As I said, the meeting's being recorded. Just a note on communications and how the meeting runs. I've got a lot of content to run through in these bullet points, which I do fairly briefly, but I will note that under each of these topics that we'll be covering today, I'll make a separate micro skills recording. So each one will probably have 5 minutes or so that I devote to it in individually. So I'll make those available separately as well. But today's I'll look at a whole number of different sort of topics in brief, and the cheat sheet that I provide deals with that as well. All right, there are two polls that are open in the room for people to put in their own experiences with Adobe Connect that they've had problems with, and also to indicate which faculty they're attending from. I would advise not clicking on any of the links just yet in the meeting room because it will launch that link for everyone. So hold your horses there. After I've shown you a few things, I'll change everyone back to participants in the room. Because if you click on anything in the link share at the moment as presenters, it will launch it for everyone. Keep that in mind. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at this morning is the use of polls. And the other thing I forgot to mention was if you've got a particular question that you would like me to address that isn't being sort of picked up by conversation in the chat pod, for example, please use the Q&A pod that's here in the middle of the screen. Put your questions in there and I'll be able to deal with them either in the session or afterwards, one by one. It's just a lot easier to capture feedback from you guys in the Q&A pod rather than the chat pod. The chat pod's more for you. All right. I'm just going to rearrange the furniture a little bit so we can see the share pod a little better. Just give me a moment. I'm going to be sharing a second screen in here so that you can see what the host sees. That's why I'm kind of going to this extent. And I'll just hide the faculty poll. Okay, so I'll get into that. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is the use of the Q&A pod. So if I share my screen, and I'm going to jump into this lovely empty layout, I can still see the chat pod and things if you want to put things in there, but I'm going to add a new Q&A pod so we can get into the bones of it. And the Q&A pod is probably fairly underused because at times it can be a bit of a fiddly experience. But basically it gives you another avenue apart from the chat pod or people raising hands or using the status button to provide feedback. First thing to familiarize yourself obviously with is the layout. And these two buttons are probably the most important part. You've got a presenter view, which is what the host or the presenter will see. And then this second button you can click on which shows what a student would see. And obviously students are only able to put in a question in the field down the bottom. It pops up in front of the presenter. If we switch back to the presenter view, there's a question and every student's questions will appear in the presenter view, but under the participant view or student view if you like, they can only see the questions they've asked or that the presenter has answered. So they can't see anyone else's questions. So there's a level of anonymity in the Q&A pod built in until the presenter decides to respond to a question, at which point they would click on it. A field opens up here at the bottom and I put in, right, here's my answer to your question, and I'm able to then decide, am I just sending it back to you privately or am I broadcasting it to everyone? Most of the time it's probably going to be that. And then if we jump back into the participant view, you can see that the student now has an answer to their question. Now you might not necessarily have time for all that in your meeting, but if the students are putting their questions in progressively throughout the session, question 1, 2, 3, let's say that's coming in, by the end of the session you're going to have a list of questions that the students have put in there that maybe you're going to deal with at your allocated time for dealing with questions, or maybe it's part of your process that you say, I will respond to the questions you've put in there after the event. Maybe they'll go onto your discussion board in i2, for example, and it gives you a place to continue with what's been brought up in the session. But the Q&A pod makes it very easy to capture all of those without having to ferret through all of the content in the chat pod. That's the biggest issue, is trying to get hold of all of the chat pod history and then finding all the individual questions and dealing with them. So the Q&A pod allows you basically to collect them all. If you're looking at the menu in the top right hand corner of the pod, the Q&A pod, you can export all the questions and email them directly to yourself very quickly. So it's probably not bad practice at that point to encourage people to put their questions that need an answer, or more specifically your answer, into the Q&A pod, and then you can respond to that after the fact. So that's probably the most common use of the Q&A pod is to target responses and collate them quickly and easily. And you've got your other options there, obviously, like being able to clear the questions that have been in there beforehand, so when you're cleaning up at the end of a session. And you can, there are some shortcuts to what those icons allow you to do, switching between participant and presenter, etc. Also, if you've got a co-pilot, like a number of presenters or hosts in the room, you're able to actually decide who's going to answer which questions. So if you're presenting your lecture and you've got someone else in there to help with responses, then potentially you can assign individual questions. Like I might say question 1 needs to be answered by, well, I'm the only one in the room, but it could be other people that the question gets assigned to. They then need to respond. So that might be too much hassle for you, but it certainly does allow for that organisation of feedback. So that's the Q&A pod very, very briefly. As I said, I will go into it in much more detail in the individual recording I'll make about Q&A pods, but it's a good one to add in if you're having trouble, particularly with large amounts of participants and their feedback not being easy to get hold of. The next one we're going to look at is polls. Polls are probably one of the most popular tools that people add into their rooms to get feedback, perhaps as to use as icebreakers at the start of a meeting. And they're really, really easy to use in Connect. You go up to the pods menu, go down to poll, add a new poll, and at that point you start customizing it. So at this point I can click on the title twice and change it to whatever I want to call the poll. I need to decide whether I want to use multiple choice, multiple answer, which is just multiple choice but with a number of options that people can select. So obviously if there isn't necessarily one correct answer but a number of answers, or short answer, which is what we were using this morning to talk about problems with Adobe Connect, at which point you punch in the question. What do you think about X? And at the moment that poll is not live to the students. I actually need to click on open, and now it's there, but I've got some more options to check off, like do I want them to be able to see the results progressively? Most of the time that's a yes from my experience, but yours might be very different. Broadcast results, and then you as well as the students can type in one response here for short answer. So we could put in my answer, and you can see it gets added to the list of answers. At the moment the whole room can see those answers. And I may very well want to get into the detail of who's answered what. And at that point I can click on view votes. This is not visible to students, and it will show you who in the room has made what response. So it's very, very quick and easy to be able to get that information. You can go back in and edit. As soon as you click on that edit button, it's going to clear any responses to that point. And edit consists of changing the type of poll you've used. So this I might switch to multiple choice, at which point I need to put in the different answers that are possible. So ABC, for example. Just one per line. I can relaunch that, and now it's put it into the more familiar options that people choose. And in broadcasting the results, it gives this visual feedback. Basically, it'll show also in brackets afterwards how many people that result actually indicates. So 100% might be a bit misleading if there's only one person, for example, or not that useful. The other thing that you need to get familiar with is obviously there are options in the menu. When you use a poll, you can choose how you want the results displayed. Well, we were looking at both percentages and numbers, so that's both, but you can choose one or the other. You can clear your responses. You can create a new poll. Okay, I've got something in the chat pod. Give me one moment and I'll jump into that. Is there a quicker way to set them up? That's pretty quick, I would have thought. It usually takes me about a minute to set it up, and I just leave it there waiting. You don't have to set it up live on the spot. I definitely recommend creating your polls in advance and then bringing them into the room when you're ready. And I'll certainly show you how to do that. But that's the general process, is to go up to your pods, choose the poll tool and the type of poll, and then populate it. But I'd certainly recommend doing it in advance, not trying to do it on the spot. Okay, so that's polls in an absolute nutshell. You can have as many of them as you want. You may very well find that a poll by itself, just text, is not necessarily all that revealing, but a poll with a share pod next to it might be a lot better if you need a visual. So if I turn around and try and find a picture that helps to inform my poll question, for example, and suddenly it's informing my structure of the question. So, what's your favorite character in X? And there's an image to support that. You have the two to go together. So they don't necessarily have to just stand alone as just text. You can make them a little bit more interesting and engaging, even just by using a share pod with an image that's loaded in there. So that's polls in a nutshell, but generally what you would find is that people create their polls in advance and either click on hide, which doesn't delete it, it just sends it into sort of the room's memory, and then when they're ready in the session to bring it in, they would go up to pods, find poll, and then find it in the list of recent polls. I've obviously got a lot in there. You're only going to have a few, but there it is, and it brings it back in, and in fact preserves the responses from previously, unless you've cleared them as well. So you can prepare as many as you like, hide them, and then bring them back in and reuse them in different sessions if the content is designed that way. So you can absolutely reuse polls, and just clicking on hide won't delete them. It just saves them for another time. Alright, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, jump back into our room, see if there's any quick questions at this point. Am I going too fast? Is everyone with me okay? Indicate either by agreement using the status button or in the chat pod is fine. Thank you, Petrina, and we'll keep moving. Okay, breakout rooms. This is probably the trickiest part, and you could run an entire session on breakout rooms by themselves. So I'm going to give you a crash course in breakout rooms now, but I would definitely recommend watching a separate recording looking at how they're specifically used and a strategy for using breakout rooms, because there's a lot to cover. So let's get right into it. I normally create what I call a foyer, and I'm going to put you all into the breakout foyer, which is a separate layout where I've basically thought about what I want the breakout activity experience to look like. Because once you launch breakouts, which you do using your attendees pod, it copies whatever setup you've got in that room at that time and puts it into everyone's breakout room. So you might not want your main room being duplicated 4 or 5 times. So the idea is that you create a new layout that has the type of pods in it that you want for each breakout group, which I've termed here foyer, breakout foyer, but you can use whatever term you like. So what I'm going to do here is again share my screen so you can see what I'm doing when I create a breakout. So I'll do that. Just bear with me for a minute. It can get a bit confusing when you're sharing within sharing sessions, etc. So I've got an empty layout here. If I switch to the breakout foyer view that we're all in at the moment. I've decided in my layout for my group of people that I want to have a webcam in their breakout group so they can see each other, videos for example. You might not want that. I want them to be able to take notes, so this is a notes pod, because as part of the activity I want them to be able to type together and or maybe appoint someone to take notes, and so we use a notes pod for that purpose. I'm going to provide instructions for the activity. This is a notes pod as well, so I've added in a second notes pod. So I can copy and paste those instructions from a Word document, for example, and drop them in there. They're probably going to need to share some kind of document between them in their individual breakout groups, so I've provided a share pod, and they've got a chat pod as well. You might not want to use a link share in the breakout rooms, for example, or a file share, but I've just added those in anyway. So what I've done is created this blank layout, because the moment that I turn the breakout rooms on, whilst it will duplicate this setup in every breakout room, every one of these pods will be empty. That's just the way it works. It doesn't take the content from within them and put them into the breakout rooms. It makes them empty. So to turn on the breakout rooms, underneath the attendees heading, there are 3 buttons. So there's the attendee view, then there's the breakout room view. That's the second one. So I'm switching that, and it shows me that at the moment I'm in the main meeting, which is everyone together. No one's been split up yet. And there's 5 groups. And the moment that I hit start breakouts, it will push everyone into breakout groups. I've also got this option to the right with these arrows which says evenly distribute from the main group. So let's assume that there's 20 of you in here, and I'm going to do this to all of you in just a second. If I click on evenly distribute, it's going to push 5 of you into 4 rooms, or 4 of you into the 5 rooms, etc. with one click. So it creates the people in whichever groups they're going to be by pressing that one button. You can create additional breakout rooms if you need to by hitting the plus button. You can delete breakout rooms that are there by hitting these crosses next to the rooms. But when you're in this main meeting room, you're not actually participating in any of the breakouts yet, and you can tell that we haven't started it yet because it says here start breakouts. Once I click on it, I get a notification saying I'm now in a breakout session, and I've got an option here to broadcast a message which will send it to everyone regardless of which group they're in, or I can end them. Those are my 2 options in breakouts. There's a little gold icon up here that's the breakout symbol, which tells me that breakouts are going on. And I'm still over here. If I look at my name, I haven't been moved into any of the breakout rooms yet. So you can, as a host, drag individuals like this and put them in any of the groups you like. You've got that manual control. So I've just put myself into breakout group 5, and I'm now into the breakout group, which has duplicated my my setting. I've actually created this breakout room in the past, so that's why it's duplicated it. But I'm going to end breakouts and put you all into this environment so you can see exactly what it looks like. So the other thing to keep in mind is that once you've been put into a breakout room, you're not going to hear what the main speaker or the person with their mic turned on has got to say anymore unless they're in your room with you. So it does separate you. And if I haven't confused you yet, then I'm not trying hard enough. So I'm going to switch us back into our environment, and I'm going to stop sharing. So here we all are together in our group, and I'm going to turn on breakouts. I'm going to distribute all of you into the different groups. So we've got 3 breakout groups at the moment that have got 5, 4 and 4 participants into those rooms, because I've only created 3 breakout rooms. And now I'm going to start the breakouts, which means that I'm going to disappear off your mics unless I come into each room. So I've hit... Hello, breakout group 1. I'm now in here with Barb, Dawn, Lee Hong, Patrina and Sue, and we're the only ones who can see what's going on in this room. Barb's using the chat pod, you guys are typing in, but the other groups are probably going, what the hell's going on? And that's where obviously you want your instructions, etc. to be obvious. Can I make the SharePod a bit larger? I can. I absolutely, like so, that SharePod. I'm going to jump into the other rooms now, just give me a moment. Hello Breakout Group 2. Here we are. I've just jumped from group number 1 and pointed out that no one could hear what I was saying in the other groups, just you guys. And obviously what's in the breakout room waiting for the participants is pretty important. You're all presenters automatically once you get put into breakouts, so you can turn your mics on and use them, etc. But only those in your group can use them. So I'm going to jump out now into group 3 and then I'll bring us all back together. Hello Breakout Room 3. Here we are, and I can see you've been entertaining yourself in the chat pod. Good stuff. As I pointed out to the others, only the people in the room can hear what's going on in here. And obviously, if there's no instructions waiting for groups when they get into these rooms, it can be a very strange padded cell type experience. You know, what are we meant to do in here? What's going on? So that's why having fairly explicit activity instructions in the rooms and things for people to do. Pete's got his webcam on. Good morning, Pete. And I'm now going to end the breakouts and bring everyone back together. So hang tight. All right, welcome back to the main room, everyone. We're back in our main breakout foyer again, and you just had a taste of what happens to students when we use breakout groups, and probably has given you an idea already of the type of logistical problems that you come across unless you've provided explicit activity instructions, things for them to do, and obviously needing to move between the different groups just to kind of facilitate that process. It's very easy to get lost. Okay, so look, we've basically looked at breakouts very, very quickly, but I'm going to bring us back into the main room and point out a couple of things. So let's go back into the workshop room. If you look across at your attendees pod, are you guys able to see the breakouts view in the attendees pod, or are you looking at just the attendee view? Right. So you can click on that second button for breakouts, I'm guessing, or maybe it's only the host. I'll confirm that shortly. But a couple of things I wanted to point out about using breakouts before we rush on through. One of them is that if you get the breakout groups to produce something together, like they've created something in the notes pod, and let's say that they've had a particular part of an activity that they needed to complete together, and then they get back together in the main group and need to present their results. Well, how do you bring that back to the main group because the breakout groups are finished? Well, the answer is that whatever content you create in the breakout rooms can also be brought back into the main group, and you would do that by going up to the pods menu. This is captured in the recording better than probably from what you can see. And there is an option there that says breakout pods, and then it allows you then to choose which breakout room and which file or which item you want to bring back in. So I might, for example, say that a group's in breakout room 2 had created some notes. I can then bring that group's notes into the main room for them to talk about. So it's not just done in isolation in the room. You can absolutely bring that back together with the main group. Okay, so we're probably horribly behind time, so I'm just going to have a look at where we can go next. Did everyone see the announcement that I sent out to all the breakouts once I'd commenced the breakouts? Thank you, Robin. Announcements to cohort, basically, probably the most commonly used feature in breakout rooms, because jumping in between one and after the other can get a bit tricky, particularly if you've got a whole lot of students and groups going on. Probably the best I've seen is 16 so far in one session, and that was a logistical nightmare with one academic. Okay, moving right along, we're going to have a look at the presenter only area. Who's used the presenter only area? If you want to tell me in the chat pod or raise your hand, either or. Anyone? Okay, Li Hong's used it, and okay, so what I'm going to do is share my screen and show you in our blank layout so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, let me just share and jump into our meeting room. Okay, so we've got a blank layout here. Let's change to one that gives me maybe a lecture. So I've got a standard meeting room going on here. Clear the content, we don't need to see that. In the meeting menu, there is an option for hosts and presenters called the presenter only area. If you click on enable presenter only area, you'll see that it's opened up this black space on the right hand side. And if I move my mouse over the top of this toggle area at the edge of it, I can make it bigger if I need to. This area is called the presenter only area, and it basically allows you to organize stuff in advance that students cannot see. At the moment, this is what participants in the room can see. This is what is in the presenter only area. So if I add new pods at that point, I might have a share pod. It goes into the presenter only area. If I have a poll that I've created or I'm going to create, it goes into the presenter only area, and so on and so forth. You can have as many of these as you want to, waiting in advance or in the wings to bring into your session. So I basically click on the grey at the top and drag that into the room when I'm ready to use it. So the presenter only area really allows you to have a whole lot of things ready in advance if you need to, or just the one. And you can turn it on and turn it off, shrink it or expand it as necessary. The other important thing to note about the presenter only area is that when you're recording a room in Adobe Connect, this is not captured. A recording will only capture what's being shown from the participant view. Okay, so I guess that's important. Hopefully you haven't got something in there that you expect to be captured in a recording, because it's not going to be visible. So the presenter only area gives you an option for storing things in advance, or maybe moving things out of the room when it becomes a bit cluttered. You could say, oh God, I don't need that at the moment. You could either hide it, or you could just drag it into your locker, if you will, your presenter only area. I'll get more into the engagement dashboard in just a second. But the presenter only area is probably a very easy way to organize things in advance without creating multiple layouts and jumping between those layouts. So if you're just using one room, you're comfortable using one room, it's got everything you want in it, and you don't want to deal with creating additional layouts for different purposes, then you might want to use the presenter only area to store your backup stuff. So that's the presenter only area, and it can be turned on and off using the meeting menu. The other good thing to note about the presenter only area is that it's usable when you use breakout rooms. So you might very well have content that you want to bring into those breakout rooms and not have to recreate every time. You can just create it all in advance in your presenter only area, launch the breakouts, and then just drag it into those rooms. So it works in breakout view as well. Okay, let's get into the engagement dashboard. This is a tool that's only recently been available for everyone to see, and I'll give you a breakdown on how it works, but essentially it takes account of how many people are in the room, and every minute it takes a bead on what they're doing to measure their level of engagement. So that might include moving their mouse around, clicking on various pods, typing into the chat pod, at the very least having the Adobe Connect screen as their front and center screen on their computer. So if they're looking at it and it's not minimized, all of those things contribute towards this equation of are they engaged, fully engaged being green and red being not engaged at all, and it gives a count of how many people are in the room, and it takes that measurement every minute. You don't go from 100 to nothing in a minute. It takes sort of 3 or 4 minutes for it to work progressively down if you're doing nothing. And it sort of gives an idea of who's paying attention and who's not. I wouldn't read much more into it than that, but certainly you get a lot of people who just have their mics on and are listening, their headphones, sorry, but are clicking on other things, working in other windows. That's going to show up basically over time, showing that that person's not totally green, for example, fully engaged. The other interesting thing that the engagement dashboard does is that it takes a summary of any polls or Q&A areas you've got going on. So to get a snapshot of all those things, so the Q&A version says that there's 4 questions, that have been put into the Q&A and only one of them have been responded to, so that's useful. It also tells me at a glance how many people have responded to my poll, how many responses there are, and in this case, none. So it does give you a snapshot view of any type of interactive activities that have been put into the room. And then we have a separate feature called the individual engagement meter, and that is giving you just the color bar view next to each participant's name. And you can see next to my name I'm green, so apparently I'm completely engaged, which is good because I'm hosting. And the way that you turn on this individual engagement meter is underneath your pod options in the attendees pod, and there is a thing here that says show individual engagement. So the engagement dashboard tool you make sure is on as a host by going into the pods menu, and you can see it underneath all the others. It's got a tick next to it. It's only visible in the presenter only area. Once it's on, you can then have a look at the individual engagement by turning that on through the attendee view. Show individual engagement. And if you want to start the session all over again, which will reset this timer, there's this little reset timer button. So I'm going to stop sharing at that point. It can get very confusing very quickly. Stop sharing. Okay. Right, we're all back together. Now I'm going to turn on the individual engagement meter in our room. So we'll switch back to the attendee view, and I'm now going to show individual engagement. And at the moment, now I can see this in the recording obviously. Can you all see it as presenters next to your status as presenters in this room? You cannot. How interesting. Well, I'll take a snapshot and share it to you, but take it from me, you're all green at the moment, which is a great sign, as it's showing that you're all completely engaged. Thank goodness. Good point, Robin. Good point. Let's keep moving through. Bandwidth considerations. Okay, bandwidth is probably the biggest issue with Adobe Connect that we hear about, apart from Flash, etc. And it basically is easily gauged by checking up in the top right hand corner of your room. There is a green bandwidth connection status meter that you can click on, and it will give you the latency. It tells you how much lag is happening in the room, and then it breaks that down into your uploads and download speed. And it's quite an interesting exercise for you to look at individually from time to time in your own rooms and see what impact doing things like sharing your webcam has on your uploads and downloads, having everyone's mic on, what it does to the upload and download speed, trying to share your screen, the impact that it has on the uploads and downloads, because that affects everyone in the room. So it's basically a tool that you can use to see just how much the bandwidth is being impacted, because the moment that you turn your mic on, you're going to see it goes up, and when you mute yourself, it goes down. So it's another reason for thinking, I guess, a bit strategically about how you want students to interact in the room, and why just turning everyone's mic on can be very problematic, because everyone's mic at the same time will contribute to that upload speed, for example, going up and up and up. So it's what's the word I'm looking for here? A compounding problem. Okay, so I could see people playing around with that at the moment and seeing the impact that's going on when they add things. I absolutely recommend that you do it. Okay, let's, as I've just talked about high bandwidth items, really sharing your screen's the highest bandwidth user that you're going to get. If you're looking at web pages, if you're trying to play something like a YouTube clip by sharing your screen first, it's not going to work for a number of reasons. You're going to get lag, but basically it's going to use the highest amount of bandwidth possible. If you've got your webcam on and you're trying to share a screen, that's kind of doubling the problem. And then if you've got mics on as well, you can see how very quickly that upload and download speed can be problematic. Okay, extensions and applications. You've probably already seen in the room that we were using today that I've got a session timer down in the bottom left hand corner that sort of is helping me keep on track time-wise. That is one example of an extension that people can add into Adobe Connect. There are many, many more. I'm going to show you a couple. I'm going to share my screen first, and then I'll take you to the website where you can find those, the Adobe Connect Applications website. I've provided a link to it in the link share, but I might advise that you not click on that until we finish the session, okay? Just have a look at what I'm showing you for the moment, and then we'll go from there. So I'll share my screen and open my browser. And here I am, the Adobe Connect Applications and Extensions website. If we scroll down past the advertising, we get into custom pods. Some of these you're going to be familiar with. Countdown timer is the one that I've been using, or maybe it's the digital timer. It is the digital timer. They both do similar things. If you'd like to make a word cloud in your room, some of these are free, probably about 50%, and others they want you to pay money for. I recommend really that you go through these and have a look. Some of them you're going to find have real potential. Some of them require a whole lot of work to prepare in advance, like this Quiz Connect business looks interesting to begin with, but you need a whole lot of time to set it up. Do you want to use SurveyMonkey inside Adobe Connect? You might try and play around with the Survey Maker tool. For Adobe Connect, there is a randomizer tool which sort of picks names from within the attendees list. So who's going to answer the next question? I hit the randomizer button and it brings up Pete. I say, great, Pete's doing it. So it's not my fault, I didn't choose you, the randomizer did it, etc. Might be a gimmick, might have value, that's completely up to you. I do recommend that you have a look through these. Some of these are good, really good. The doorbell I'll talk about in just a second and why that's fantastic, but there are a whole bunch that you should play around with and see what they do. Basically what you do with any of these, if you decide you want to have them in your room, is you just need to download them and then upload them into a SharePod. So for example, I might say, I want this doorbell pod. I'm clicking on it. Brings up more information. Great, yep, fantastic. I want it. Hit download. It downloads it onto my computer in just a moment. Okay, so I can see it down the bottom there. It's loaded. I want to keep that. I'm going to go back into my room now, so I'll stop sharing. In my SharePod here, I'm now able to hit the drop-down menu and select Share Document, browse my computer, find my downloads that I just went to, and in theory, it should be at the top of that list. Downloads. Let's sort by date, shall we? Doorbell. There we go. Hit open, and it loads that pod into the room. Remember, you can have as many SharePods as you like, so don't worry if you think that it's taken all the space. The doorbell one's really interesting. Click on it, it rings a bell. Okay, no problem. At the moment it's set so that anyone who comes into the room will ring the bell automatically. So you might say, if I didn't want to be staring at my screen, for example, waiting to see who turns up for something that I've set up, but I'd like to be notified, I can now jump across into another window, do something else on the computer, or as long as I can hear the computer, I will know when someone has joined the room. So you might say, for example, that you've set up drop-in sessions and you've told students that you'll be available from a certain time to a certain time, like consultation, etc. But how are you? You're just going to sit there and wait for people to turn up, or perhaps you're going to work on something else in another window, but you want to know when someone turns up. So the doorbell pod is actually really nifty for that purpose. It simply just rings. You could also have some instructions in here that say ring the bell if I'm not here. And off they go. You've got a way of using Adobe Connect for consultation or drop-ins without having to sit in your room waiting for something to go on. So the doorbell is useful for that purpose. I'm not sure if any of you see value in that proposition, but by all means give it a try. That's just one example of the applications, etc., that are available on that website. Okay, so that was the applications and extensions website, and we had a look at the idea of using drop-ins, or you're setting up an Adobe Connect layout for consultation with students or drop-ins, and how to get that notification from the doorbell. How are we going? We're pretty close to time. Great. We'll have a look at this last option here, student-only rooms. There are a few examples where people would like students to have access to Adobe Connect rooms without needing a host, without you having to set them up and be there and run them and oversee them. So student-only Adobe Connect rooms. Now, short of actually logging jobs and having an ESC, for example, set up a whole bunch of students as hosts with access to a particular room and doing that session after session, which is just not really sustainable at scale. We just don't have the people. You can actually make meeting rooms available to students without you needing to be there, and it's really simple. I'm going to share my screen so you can see exactly what I'm clicking on as a host. Let's go back to my room. I'll get rid of my presenter only area by disabling that, and I'll say, right, I've got this room for my students that I've set up the way that I want, and I want them to be able to join this meeting room without me needing to be here in future. As the host, you can go to your meeting, manage access and entry, and then the last option on this list says auto promote participants to presenters. As soon as that's checked, you get a notification up here with a little eye on it saying, at the moment, auto promote participants. Well, it's on, and I can turn it off from here. But now, as long as students have the link to this room, I don't need to be around. They can come into this room and use it for their own purposes. So you may very well want to create rooms for students to use for their group work, study buddy type idea. Maybe you've got it set up so that groups for a particular assessment get together in particular rooms to work together. You don't want to have to launch them yourself as the host and be there for people to come in. If you're not aware, basically an Adobe Connect room will kick out a participant that joins it. Even if the room's open, we'll kick them out if there's no host in there after 15 minutes. That's the way that it works, unless you have this turned on. So that meeting and access and entry auto promote will allow you to create those open access rooms for students to use. And when they come into those rooms, they will be presenters. So that's exactly what's happened today. I'll stop sharing this room. All of you, I've got that button switched on, and all of you have been made presenters when you joined the room, which is why you were able to do things to the various pods in here. Okay, now I'm aware I haven't really stopped for questions that much, so I'll take a moment to look at some of these, but by all means put things into the chat pod, etc. now. I'm around for the next 10 to 15 minutes, and I know we've covered a whole lot of content very quickly. So thank you all for being so patient. Music. Would you like to hear it or know how to do it, David? Right, okay. So that pod that's down the bottom is just a share pod. So if we look at this main share pod that's at the top of the screen here together, when you hit the drop down, the second option there is share document. It's a real misnomer because it's not just about documents. You can load many types of files in there. For example, you could load an MP4 video in there, or you could load an MP3 file, music track, into that room. So as long as you've got the MP3, you load it in there via that share document command, and then it comes up into this sort of player view, which you can condense, and then it'll start playing, for example. So it'll take MP4 tracks for video, MP3 tracks for music, or a number of MP3 tracks if you've managed to consolidate them into one file. And if you'd like the lowdown on how to make that kind of mix single file, I can definitely send that to you afterwards. That's not a problem. Pete says, I'm interested in finding out how many